everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at an Edwardian women's jacket. We're going to be digging into the construction of this original garment better by trying to actually reproduce it. This garment is a piece that is owned by Abby Cox. While she hasn't featured it in any of her videos yet, you can see it in the background of her video talking about the myth that women were always smaller back then. And I know when I saw it in person, I absolutely fell in love with it, and lots of other people have expressed their interest in this garment as well, so she very generously lent it to me in order for me to reproduce it. Now, when I am working with an original piece that I actually want to reproduce, the very first place that we have to start once we get images of it or get it in hand is to try and understand the context of it, meaning that I need to know what the date is. Based off of my general knowledge and understanding of fashion history, I could pretty well date this jacket somewhere in the 1900s. There are a lot of elements such as the sleeves, the collar shape, the overall curves of the garment, or the fact that it's not super fitted the whole way down the body. All sorts of little tiny details that sort of narrow in the dates for me. So I had a general idea that it was probably going to sit somewhere between 1905 and 1910. So that meant that the best place for me to start is just to go to Pinterest and start looking for fashion plates for each one of those years. The most distinct part of this garment to me was the sleeves. They are a very unusual shape, they are a very unusual way of setting them into the garment. It's a very distinct sleeve style. So I wanted to start off looking for that exactly, and that narrowed it down really fast. I found lots of fashion plates and even a few photographs from fashion houses that dated those sleeves right to 1907. There were a few stragglers in 1908, but the vast majority sat in the 1907 range. This at least gives me an idea of what sort of undergarments would have been worn with the garment, what sort of shirt would have been worn underneath, what sort of skirt is it going to balance the best with, how should I expect the shape and structure of this garment to be. The nice thing is that by having the exact year, I can then go do more research into 1906. I looked at more fashion plates, more magazines, came across a few references in some French fashion magazines that consistently referred to that particular style, not just with the sleeves, but with the hip-length jacket style that closed up the front as a costume tailleur, which is essentially translated to a tailored suit. So not only do I now know that that general era of construction is what we're looking at, I can also pinpoint that it's going to be even more tailored than normal. Because interestingly enough, inside of the garments of the 1900s, though they are very often blousy and loose and gauzy and flowy, there's a lot of structure. They are very deceptive about what is inside of those garments. And by knowing that they called this a tailored suit, it's going to signify to me that I should expect to find a lot of things inside of this garment. So I can go at the next step of actually taking a pattern and exploring the garment, knowing roughly what I need to be looking for and what to expect, meaning this is not going to be loose and flowy and only a couple of layers. The first step to really look at with the original garment is what sort of textiles it's made out of. The body is made out of a very slubby wool. It actually has an inner layer of a very lightweight linen just beneath it on some of the pieces. The lining is a very lovely cream silk satin. However, it has unfortunately not survived the years very well, so it has quite a few worn spots and holes. This, however, is fortunate for us in the fact that we can actually see inside of the garment and figure out what sort of textiles were used for the interfacings as well. There's also a fair amount of trim on this garment. However, the larger dark trim that you see around all the edges is not original. It is an antique trim, but it is not what originally was meant to go with the garment. Originally, as we can see from some very slight remnants, there was a silk taffeta binding around all of the edges, and then the edge of the binding was covered up by a very delicate little embroidered trim. When it came down to choosing the fabrics for my version, I really wanted to hold true to the color as much as anything else, so I found a wool suiting that was in my collection already. and even though it's a little bit lighter weight than it should be and honestly has a smidgen of stretch to it, the stretch will be negated by all the interfacing and the lining as well. It's a very lovely but lightweight and fairly stiff silk satin. For the interfacing, I used a combination of different types of interfacing. The main body of a lot of the interfacing is a very lightweight sort of canvas. It's not necessarily as heavy as an Italian canvas or a lot of the collar canvases that you see, and there are a few other oddball tailoring interfaces that we'll talk about as we get to that point. When it came to the construction, the hardest part, and for me the most exciting part, is figuring out what the order of operations has to be. Especially when you're dealing with something that has already been constructed, you get to do a lot of sleuthing, figuring out what stitches go through what layers, what has to come before which section. Though there are some obvious things that usually occur first, the body is made, the sleeves are made, then they are assembled, it's not always the case, and with such an unusual pattern, I wanted to make doubly sure that it was still assembled in what we consider a common way, and it seemed to be the case. The body did look like it was constructed, and the sleeves constructed, and the two were combined, and then the lining was finished after that as a larger general process. When it came to the interfacing, that was when it started to get a little bit more complicated. Very often in tailored pieces, the front interfacing sections will be completely pad stitched and layered and then stitched into the front, and then the front will be stitched into the rest of the body. In this case, it didn't have to be done like that since the front interfacing was not terribly complex. The only real interaction it has with the front comes in the form of the dart up at the collar, and it needed to lay over the shoulder. So I decided to go ahead and stitch it in after I assembled the body, just because it was a fairly simple piece. Now, when it comes to the hem interfacing, that is a wholly different story. I found it a little bit unusual in the fact that they had cut it as a single whole piece. They didn't overlay or piece anything together. I could find that by being able to see through just enough holes and just enough places on the lining that it was one semicircle that gradually went onto the bias as it curved around. So I knew that that had to be put in after the entire body was assembled so it could lay down flat over all of the seams. The next unusual interfacing section is the collar. Now, the only thing that's unusual about the interfacing and the collar isn't the fact that it's there, that's a very normal thing. It's that it has such an unusual stitch pattern. It really was fairly excessive and an interesting design unto itself. There's extra complication with the fact that there is all of the soutache and other trim on this piece, but it was a very interesting pattern to get to follow. The curves down at the bottom are there to make sure that the collars stand. Essentially the piece that goes upright in the back of your neck is nice and stiff and sturdy and won't collapse under the constant movement of your head or the positioning of your neck. The zigzags, I think, were just a decorative way to sort of connect the rest of the piece together. So I had fun getting to stitch this very elaborate design that no one will really ever see on the finished garment. I did find it of note that some of the zigzags actually run off the raw edge of the collar, which signified to me that they might have actually left the seam allowance on, stitched the entire piece together, trimmed it back, and then bound the edges later, and it might be that the fabric frayed a lot, so they left the seam allowance on until the very last moment. The edges are then finished by a silk binding. Now this is where it took a fair bit of sleuthing, because you can see right there that though there is machine stitching on some of the binding, there's hand stitching on some of the binding as well. And the collar was a particularly unusual way of doing silk binding. What they did, because they needed both the undercollar and the overcollar to be finished off nicely, is they went ahead and started off by stitching the binding to the wrong side of the very long edge and flipping it. They then went in and mitered the corners and hand-stitched the undercollar short edges rather than machining them, so that way it was a little bit easier to do. because managing to machine stitch that and flip it around miter corner is very complex. This way honestly may have been faster than me taking the time to figure it out or go look for a video on how to do it. They then will take the excess of the binding, flip it over the edge, and fold back the raw edge, and that's where it gets top stitched down. So that's what you will actually see on the external part of the collar, is a top stitched, fairly wide silk binding. The front closure of this jacket is particularly interesting in that it has what I'm calling a waistcoat front, and the little waistcoat strips actually are what contain the hooks and eyes that will allow the garment to close in front. It is bound in silk as well, not unlike the collar, but with a slightly different binding method. Of note here is because it is where the hooks and eyes attach, it needs a little bit of extra reinforcement. So in addition to the interfacing that we saw on the collar, they also added a tailor's tape running just along that front edge. Another place that I had to add a secondary reinforcement is at the bottom of the hem. Now, digging into there, I found that there was an additional piece of bias interfacing, which was very akin to the beaded linen that I've talked about in some of my previous videos. It's a very lightweight, but very stiff type of linen. Now, the finishing on this garment is a little bit unusual. The lining has not yet been set in, but we're going to go ahead and top stitch around the front and hem edges. This will be through the front facing, but also through all of those layers of interfacing around the hem. And that's how that bias piece of beaded linen and the curved interfacing will actually get anchored to the jacket. So once we've completed the waistcoat front, it then gets stitched into the front of the jacket. The careful thing here is that it has to only go through some of the layers. This sort of hand-running stitch does not appear on the exterior of the garment, but it does seem to go through just enough to catch the interfacing occasionally for some reinforcement. Now that we have the body generally done, we're going to move on to the sleeves. The cuffs are generally done in much the same way that the waistcoat front was. The binding method is akin to that of the collar, except that it is just top stitched on the exterior, and then the interior is left as a raw edge to be hidden by the lining. The lining on the cuffs, just like that on the waistcoat eventually, is just simply filled in by hand. The edge of the sleeves is also an unusual construction technique in the fact that the cuffs just have their raw edge turned up. It's not hidden or finished entirely. And then the sleeve itself will also have a similar circumstance. The fabric of the sleeve is only as long as it needs to be, whereas the lining is just a little bit longer, and once it's pleated, will be folded up to cover up the raw edge of the wool. The folded edge will then be matched up with the cuff and stitched in that way. It doesn't entirely hide the raw edge, as you'll see. It's a bit of an unusual treatment for the cuff, as the cuff is very much an applied piece in this situation, but it was a fairly easy method for the actual finishing. Before we get into the lining, the hooks and eyes get stitched in first. This means that all of those big nasty stitches, in order to really anchor your hooks and eyes down, will be completely hidden by your lining, and that is a wonderful fact. It also really forces you to get all of your closures on before you get to the end of the garment and decide it's just not worth it, because we have all done that. In the case of the original jacket, this is the one place I found that they used a double, very heavy thread to do the stitching rather than a single lighter weight thread, which was found throughout the rest of the garment. The final bits on this garment are very unusual in the fact that they are not all original. So the buttons that are sitting on the cuffs are not the original buttons. The buttons that are on the body, I think, are, however. Underneath that cut steel button, there is the evidence of a little rosette, which makes perfect sense in the fact that it would cover up the little raw bits that I was seeing around my cuff from the hem of the sleeve. So I guessed at about what size the rosette needed to be, knowing that it could only be so big before it actually extended past the hem of the cuff, and that it needed to be big enough to actually cover up all of the raw seam allowances, and ended up with what I think was about the right size. The other piece that is missing from the original garment is that of the ties down the front. The attachment point for these ties is underneath the ends of the collar, and there is so little surviving that it is very difficult to say exactly what was there. So the ties that I added were very conjectured as to the width and length. I tried to make sure that whatever I chose balanced well with the garment and was proportionally correct. I have to say that I think this jacket is going to be one of my absolute favorite pieces in my wardrobe. While I did make it as a historic garment, I did also choose to leave off some of the trim and simplify it slightly so that way I can wear it as a modern piece. I know perfectly well that though I have a lot of historic clothing, it just doesn't see the light of day nearly as much as it should. And with this particular style being so eye-catching and so unusual, I knew that I could wear it with lots of different modern pieces. So I made the decision to keep it very simple and clean lines. I can always add the trim later if I really, really, really want to, or just make it again multiple times, because it is that wonderful of a jacket. But the key for me with this whole process is the fact that I got to learn so much about how more tailored women's garments were made in that time period. There were layers upon layers of interfacing inside. There was so much structure and a combination of machine stitching and hand stitching. The amount of effort and patterning and construction that went into this jacket is just mind-blowing to me. It is so beautiful, and it really helps me understand why some of my garments that I've made of this time period before weren't quite right. Even though they were patterned off of original drafting books of the time, I didn't necessarily know exactly how to construct them. And this jacket taught me a lot of interesting tricks on how to help reinforce small areas or large areas of your garment in order to make sure that the fabric has enough substance. So they aren't expecting one fabric to do all the work. They're really expecting there to be multiple layers helping to build up that structure and that fullness and that feeling of a luxurious, heavy, rich fabric that we feel like we have to spend a lot of money to get. But in reality, it's just the layers. So I learned so much from this jacket, and I really hope that you did too. And hopefully I can do more of these sorts of projects in the future if that's something you're interested in. But for now, I want to leave you with a few experimentations that I did on how to take this very historic garment and history bound, as it were, and wear it with a few of my modern pieces.